Welcome to the Voice Foundation's Virtual Voice Symposium. This is the special session. This is a time when we have an opportunity to dive deep into a particular topic of interest across all of our disciplines. And this year we've selected the topic of vocal fatigue. Is it worth the effort? I am Nancy Pearl Solomon. I am a research speech-language pathologist at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, and I have been organizing and moderating these special sessions for the past 16 years. And I'm really excited about this year's topic because I've done some of my own research on this topic, and I'm really excited to bring you and me up to date on what's going on in the field. So I'm going to start with an introductory talk where we go over some basic concepts, and I give a bit of a historical perspective on how we have looked at vocal fatigue. So my talk is titled The 3 M's of Vocal Fatigue: Mucosal, Muscular, and Mental. As a U.S. government employee, I am obliged to tell you that the views expressed in this presentation are mine and not those of the Department of Defense or U.S. government, and I have no other conflicts of interest to disclose. So what is vocal fatigue? Well, simply stated from a classic clinical textbook that has been brought up to date with its latest edition just this year, it is a frequent descriptor for a well-known set of symptoms. When a patient comes to see you, they tell you what's going on, they talk about the course of what's happening, you know what it is, but you don't know it from hearing. We have to hear the patient's symptoms. So what might they be? What's in that symptom box? They may report increased vocal effort, increased vocal discomfort, perhaps some difficulty with pitch range and flexibility of pitches. They could report that they don't have the same power or ability to project as usual, and perhaps even voice quality becomes deteriorated, such as hoarse or raspy. They will report that to you, that also that their voice is ineffective and maybe unstable, a little unpredictable. The big picture here is this is happening over the course of a day. So a really common complaint is my voice gives out by the end of the day. I wrote a review paper a dozen years ago about vocal fatigue, and I defined it this way: that vocal fatigue is a perception by the voice user, manifested primarily as an increased sense of vocal effort that increases over time with voice use and subsides with voice rest. The changes in phonation may or may not be audible or otherwise identifiable by a listener or by acoustic or physical measures. So again, the hallmark here is that the patient perceives the change and tells you about it. You may or may not hear anything and probably can't measure what's going on. And we will talk about that more as this special session continues. Now, vocal fatigue can occur without any dysphonia or pathological tissue changes. If a voice user starts to compensate in a way that becomes maladaptive or just needs to continue using their voice in a very demanding way, it is possible they would develop dysphonia or pathological tissue changes, but it's not necessary. Vocal fatigue can exist by itself as a pure condition. I came from a bit of a physiology background in my doctoral program where I took a minor in motor control, and we talked about fatigue from a general physiology point of view. Anoka and Stewart, who are 2 of the professors I worked with when I was doing my Ph.D. work at University of Arizona, defined fatigue this way: as a progressive increase in the effort required to exert a desired force, and the eventual progressive inability to maintain this force in sustained or repeated contractions. So effort goes up and performance goes down. McCabe and Tietze took this definition and applied it to voice. So they define vocal fatigue as a progressive increase in phonatory effort accompanied by a progressive decrease in phonatory capabilities. Generally in physiology, when they talk about fatigue, they split it into central mechanisms and peripheral mechanisms, where central fatigue refers to what's happening in the brain. What's the motivation, the drive behind telling that lower motor neuron system what to do, and perceiving that as effort. The peripheral system fatigue can exist in the lower motor neuron and in the muscle itself, in the muscle fibers. So this is generally how fatigue is studied and broken down. When we talk about vocal fatigue, we have to talk about another concept as well. And that is the concept of non-muscular tissue fatigue, because the vocal folds have membranes and ligaments, the larynx has joints, and we need to talk about the stress and the strain put on, especially the membranes and the ligaments, and how that might affect function. We also need to discuss the viscosity of the system, because as we know from the viscoelastic properties of the vocal folds, that is what's most important for vocal fold vibration. If we look at mechanisms that are peripheral for fatigue, we can look at laryngeal muscles and respiratory muscles. And when we talk about central fatigue for the voice, this is generally a report of overall tiredness. I just don't want to, I can't go on, I'm exhausted, or an increase in the sense of effort where fatigue is growing and you haven't quit yet, but your effort level has gone up. So let's start by talking about non-muscular tissue effects. Titsa wrote this article on the mechanical stresses that are involved in phonation and concluded that prolonged high-pitched phonation leads to increased frictional energy loss, increased heat dissipation, and increased tissue viscosity. And all of these things will affect how easily the vocal folds can oscillate. I looked at some recent literature just to see what's been going on lately in the area of non-muscular tissue of the larynx, and found this nice study by Dr. Hunter, who will be speaking soon in this session, about using a computational model based on parameters derived from 2 human larynges. And they subjected in the model, they subjected a 10 hertz stress change, so lengthening and shortening of this vocal fold model that's supposed to simulate a fast vibrato or a fast tremor. And what they found is that the stress relaxation of the tissues differed for the vocal fold cover portion of the model and the vocal ligament. Together you get a combined effect. So the tissues do respond differently. A study by Arath et al. Looked at the pressures inside the tissues and looked to see what happens to the pressures when there is viscous dissipation and tissue elasticity changes of the vocal folds in a viscoelastic model from contact stress, and found that the pressure increases when the properties of the vocal folds degrade. So we need to look at the pressures around the vocal folds too, because over time that could become a problem. And this nice study by Wang et al. Looked at blood vessel effects or blood circulation effects, and their measurements were about blood perfusion and vascular permeability when they stimulated a rabbit ear for 3 hours continuously at a frequency that's typical of a adult male fundamental frequency, and showed that there were changes in the blood perfusion and permeability that we need to consider when applying this model to vocal fatigue. One of the measures that I've used and others have used to look at some of the physiologic changes, particularly about the vocal fold cover, is phonation threshold pressure. This is the minimum amount of lung pressure required to just barely get the vocal folds to vibrate. So it gives a sense of how easy it is to get those tissues moving. And overall, the literature, it has shown, and there's a couple of recent studies showing that if you talk for a long period of time, then the minimum lung pressure required to phonate increases. I'm showing you here some data from my papers where after 2 hours of loud reading, everybody's PTP levels went up, and up is, in this case, is not a good thing. The lower the pressure, the better, the more healthy the tissues are, presumably. And we looked at the effects of hydration as well. That wasn't as clear cut, but some people seem to benefit from being well hydrated from drinking water. PTP is usually used in studies of hydration, and there's a summary at the bottom of this slide about one meta-analysis and one systematic review where they found that that PTP tends to decrease with good hydration and increase with poor hydration, whether it's superficial or systemic. But for this purpose today, we're looking at the results based on prolonged talking. So this gives you an indication that the mucosal effects are real. They may be measurable and could reflect vocal fatigue. When we look at muscle effects, we're looking at the laryngeal muscles or the respiratory muscles. And we'll start by talking just a little bit about the intrinsic laryngeal muscles. These are old studies, but there really isn't much new that tells a different story. I like these because they point out that when we look at the muscle properties of the larynx, we see that they are, the majority are non-fatigable, and a good chunk more are fatigue resistant. And so the muscles in the larynx are fatigue resistant. There's a study where Cooper and Rice stimulated the thyroarytenoid muscle in intact dogs who were anesthetized, and they did that for an hour and couldn't fatigue the TA muscle. So it looks like laryngeal muscles are not very fatigable. Respiratory muscles, even more so. Using whole body exercise at very high intensity, you may be able to fatigue these muscles, but they really are very robust. And a case in point is this study by Tiller et al., where they examined 9 adults who ran 10 marathons in 10 consecutive days, and they did not elicit chronic changes in respiratory function or perceptions of dyspnea or breathlessness. So this respiratory system is quite robust, unlikely to fatigue. I think we don't have to worry too much about the muscles. So what about central mechanisms? Here we are talking about the sense of effort, which is usually assessed by self-report scales or questionnaires. There are more standard measures now, and we'll be hearing more about those measures today when Dr. Nanjan Deswaran talks about how to measure vocal fatigue. The physiologic indicators, there are some. They are not applied in the area of vocal fatigue, but have been applied in other study areas. And Dr. Stephanie Kaczynski is going to talk to us about those also in a talk with this special session. So what do we know about sense of effort for phonation and respiration? Well, perceived exertion for talking, for voice, does increase as vocal demand increases, as shown in this review article by Dr. Hunter and colleagues. Respiratory effort, similarly, there is literature showing that as demands on inspiratory and expiratory breathing occur, there are reports of increased respiratory effort. Now, we know in speech-language pathology that using effort has actually become a popular therapeutic approach to people who have hypophonia, that have voice problems, based in usually Parkinson's disease or other neurological diseases of speech. And they have used respiratory effort treatment as a comparison to high-effort phonatory treatment. Usually what we find is the high-effort phonatory treatment is more effective to improve vocal loudness, although in this systematic review, respiratory effort also seems to improve vocal loudness, maybe not as much, and perhaps not for as long. But we use this high effort in order to improve voice and improve other aspects of speech as well. One of the key features of using a high effort phonation treatment is recalibrating for the patient that sense of effort. How much effort they put into it needs to be calibrated as normal, where they think it's perhaps too much effort. And so this whole sense of effort concept is very important for therapy. So we reviewed now the 3 basic mechanisms of vocal fatigue. And just to summarize for you, here are some take-home messages. First, that vocal fatigue is perceived by the voice user. It may or may not be heard by the listener. It occurs over time with voice use. It may be impacted by non-muscular laryngeal tissue changes, but unlikely to be due to muscle fatigue. It definitely involves an increased sense of effort. And what we are going to learn about during the rest of this special session is that vocal fatigue is being actively reconceptualized and redefined. You'll hear about that from Dr. Hunter. It has been a focus of new assessment approaches. You will hear about that from Dr. Nanjan Deswaran. and it has been and can be treated successfully by voice specialists, and we'll hear about that from Dr. Guzman. So I have references. If you'd like, I can send them to you. But what I'd like to do now is tell you about the next few talks and who our speakers are. So to start, Stephanie Kaczynski is a research investigator at the Audiology and Speech Pathology Center at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, and I am proud to call her my colleague. She's also a faculty affiliate at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Kaczynski received her Ph.D. from the University of Illinois in cognitive psychology with a minor in linguistics and developmental psychology. Her work to that point addressed cognitive links between visual perception and speech production. She turned her attention to hearing research during her postdoctoral fellowship at the Medical University of South Carolina. Stephanie's work focuses on using objective measures of cognitive effort, including pupillometry and neural imaging, to assess and manage communication challenges in difficult listening environments. I am delighted to have Dr. Kaczynski talk to us today. This is her first Voice Foundation symposium, and she is sharing her insights into effort through the eyes, ears, and brain. The next presentation is by Dr. Eric Hunter, professor in the Department of Communicative Sciences and Disorders at Michigan State University. Dr. Hunter currently serves as the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication Arts and Sciences and is the director of the Trifecta Initiative for Interdisciplinary Health Research at Michigan State University. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees at Brigham Young University in physics and mathematics, and started to study speech acoustics during his PhD program at the University of Iowa in speech science. Eric's research addresses many things, including occupational voice use, signal processing, biomechanics of speech articulators and the vocal system, and muscle mechanics. His most recent work focuses on vocal fatigue, and he's going to talk to us about redefining vocal fatigue. Chyanne ODonnell is an associate professor in the Department of Audiology and Speech-Language Pathology at East Tennessee State University. She received her PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in Communication Science and Disorders. Dr. Nanjun developed and validated the Vocal Fatigue Index. Her research focuses on understanding vocal fatigue, including its definition, mechanisms, and potential treatment options, specifically in professional voice users. Clinically, Chaya works with teachers and singers with a variety of voice disorders. Dr. Nanjun presentation is on measuring and monitoring the complex nature of vocal fatigue. The final presentation in this special session is by Marco Guzman. Dr. Guzman is a voice pathologist in the Department of Otolaryngology, Las Condes Clinic, Chile. He is a member of the faculty at the Universidad de los Andes, Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. He serves as adjunct professor at the Tampere University in Finland. Dr. Guzman received his PhD in speech techniques and vocology from the Tampere University. Marco also holds a certification in vocology from the University of Iowa and National Center for Voice and Speech. He will be providing the clinical perspective on this topic with his talk on optimizing vocal efficiency and economy to combat vocal fatigue. After you view each of the presentations, please remember to tune back in on Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for an hour-long live panel panel discussion where we will take your questions and do our best to answer them. So you can submit your comments and questions in advance or in real time during the panel discussion. So I thank you for listening to my talk. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the presentations in this special session, and I hope to welcome you in person in Philadelphia next year at the 50th anniversary symposium of the Voice Foundation. Thank you.